Hello, everyone. Welcome to this second session of our Digital Fast Track series. I'm Jean-Yves, Senior Director for Strategic Partnerships at Microsoft, and I have the privilege and the pleasure to moderate today's discussion. As you may know, the Digital Fast Track series is a series of panels which are jointly organized by the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies at Geneva, the Geneva Representative Office of UNESCO and Microsoft, to discuss policy topics around digital technologies in the light of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our first event took place early October on Teachers' Day, and it focused on education and the digital divide in the light of SDG 4 on quality education. The third event will take place in February next year, and it will examine the role of women in technology on the occasion of the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, and that will be in connection with SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. Today, as we are preparing for Human Rights Day this coming Friday, we have a panel that will discuss the relationship between artificial intelligence, human rights, and ethics. The topic is not new, and indeed Asimov posited the 3 laws of robotics in 1950. But the deployment of artificial intelligence systems in an increasing number of areas of people's life, from education to access to finance, to health, to production, and many others, is highlighting the pressing need for a thorough and holistic approach of this question. We have 3 panelists to discuss the question today, and let me introduce them. We have Lorna McGregor, who is a professor of international human rights law and director of the Economic and Social Research Council project on human rights, big data, and technology at University of Essex. Sasha Rubel is the dynamic coordinator of UNESCO's work on artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and internet governance. And we have also Steve Crown, who is leading Microsoft Human Rights team with the benefit of a long experience in several product groups at Microsoft, the lawyer, and also lead legal representative of Microsoft in China. Now, rather than a succession of keynotes, this panel will be a dialogue and a discussion of a hypothetical case, which I'll share in a second. But before I do so, please let me remind and emphasize that we have a fantastic chat box on which you're more than welcome to share your comments and questions. And Daniel Akinmade will intervene in the discussion each time there is questions coming from you to the panelists. So please do make use of the opportunity of putting questions to our 3 panel members. And now the case. As digital services are bringing universal information real time to our home, they are also the preferred channel to spread fake news and disinformation. The operators of a digital news service are developing AI tools to identify and remove fake news from the service. And yet the volume of fake news on that service is so big that the AI tool is designed so as to remove automatically articles which, based on the service in really broad data sets, are obviously false, while articles whose falseness is less obvious are then referred to human moderators for their review and decision. Another question to the panel. Do you think that machines can make decisions, such as the one in this case does, with respect to quote unquote obviously false news? Or is it the case that machines should only assist humans in making decisions and not decide by themselves? What do human rights law and ethics tell us on this question of human agency? Now, the example which I have taken deals with freedom of expression, which may or may not be a complicating factor. But I would hope that our 3 panelists will consider the question more generally, the question of human agency more generally. For instance, also with respect to AI systems that review applications for student loans, or artificial intelligence systems that help spray fertilizers on crops. So what do you think about this question of human agency, the role of machines, the role of humans? Lorna, I'll give you the floor first. Tell us a little bit what you think of this example and the broader question which I just mentioned. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, and hello to everyone participating in the event today, and thanks so much for the invitation. So I think this is a really interesting and pertinent question, and there are a lot of dimensions to it. So I think maybe just first talking about how we approach these questions overall. These questions about in what situations can machines make or support decisions. Looking at it sort of systematically, for me, the starting point really is, do we need the machine? Or in most cases, do we need the machine learning algorithm in the first place to make or support decisions? And I think that that's a really basic question, but one that often gets skipped in these discussions. So what I mean by this is, in the particular context, what's the justification for bringing in a level of automation to the decision-making process in the first place? So what is the problem that we're seeking to solve by bringing in an algorithm, for example? And are we sure that automation is the best way to solve this problem? Or is there another way, including a non-technological approach? So I think that that's the first thing that we really need to be able to understand. Then once we understand the justification, and hopefully that justification is more than just something like efficiency or cost saving, we then need to look at the question of risk. And obviously, you know, in a company like in the example we've got, it's going to have a lot of risks to look at, including environmental. But one set of risks is going to be to human rights. And these risks can arise from the nature of the decision making itself. What is a decision being made about? So about student loans, about education, you know, about fraud, health. Risks just inherently arise from these types of decisions to human rights, but they can also arise from the introduction of algorithms or automation. And what I would suggest as sort of basic principles is that where there are clear risks to human rights, either due to the nature of the data relied upon by the algorithm or the way that it's operating and the types of outcomes it's having, or where what the decision is about presents clear risks to human rights, that's a situation where we want to not see full automation, where we do want to see humans participating in either of those situations. But even where we have an algorithm being used as some kind of support to a human-led decision, it's not going to be enough for us to say that a human is the final decision maker. We're going to be concerned with the nature of the safeguards in place. We're still going to want to have full scrutiny of this algorithm, what's going into it, what are the types of outcomes it's producing. We're going to want to know, like you said in the beginning, Jean-Yves, about how is the human interacting with that algorithm in making its decision? Is there a risk of automation bias or deferring to the algorithm? What does the oversight system look like that's really watching how this algorithm is being used? And crucially, can the individual about whom a decision is actually being made, can they effectively challenge its use? And if we can't get good answers to those types of questions, we go back to the beginning. Should we be using an algorithm in the first place? So then when we look at the problem scenario, we know that content moderation is a very complicated area for human rights. And why is that? Because on the one hand, we know that there's a risk to human rights if content is moderated, that there's a risk to freedom of expression, but also to opinion, and where it goes further, when we see accounts being suspended, there could be risks to work, to right to life, to education. But on the other hand, if content's left up or if it has a prominent place, we also know that it can result in discrimination, spreading of hate, it can impact elections, democracy. So it's a really tricky type of decision to make. And we also know that it's inherently complex because when we're looking at content, we know that a lot relies on contextual interpretation. So then when we are relying on context, that's something that's really tricky for automating without human input. But then, of course, you've got this problem of scale and the demand for speed in decision making. So what I think is interesting about this problem is that we've got a company that's making a distinction between content on the grounds of content that's obviously fake and content where truthfulness is in question. And it makes this distinction based on a reliance on data sets. And for me, without more information, that looks like a really narrow way to decide when you can use automation and when you can't. So what I'm wanting to know is, what is that full system that this company's put in place to protect human rights? What are the policies that it's developed that actually enable it to deal with content in this way? And has it developed these policies with stakeholder participation and consultation? Has it figured out how this content moderation is going to be legal, necessary, proportionate? How is it figuring out what is obviously false and what is questionable? Again, remembering that there's interpretation involved. How is it going to figure out that it's not overextending, over-removing or under-removing? Is it using fact checkers? You know, is it really enough to rely on these data sets? What do we know about these data sets? Have they been open to scrutiny and for discussion? And what are the systems oversight in place to check this system? Is there independent scrutiny? And again, just to end with what happens when you have been subject to this content moderation? Can you actually challenge it? Can you request human review? And how do we know the nature of these decisions? Are they going to be published? Are we going to get information about it? So, you know, really just to say, I think these are really complicated areas and we can't really just say yes or no, but we really need to know what these really effective systems are in place to protect human rights. I think I'll stop here because I'm keen to hear what the others have to say.
Great. I have 5 questions already to put to you, but I'll let Steve but because it's super interesting and I like the way you have laid out a very structured approach, very structured approach of the question, but they raise many questions, at least some of them coming to my mind. But I'll leave Steve or Sasha first to react. I really no order.
Sasha, do you want to go?
Sure, with pleasure. Thank you very much, Lorna, for that brilliant introduction to the problem and the challenges related to the questions of content moderation, because freedom of expression, but also access to information is really at the heart of UNESCO's work. And one of the things that you said that particularly struck me is the need for us to move from the question, can we do it, to the question, should we do it? Not just because AI is a very sexy technology that everybody wants to work with, but to say, okay, well, technically, what are the advantages of deploying AI-based solutions? And we see, reflecting also, Jean-Yves, on what you were saying in the introduction, we see that this is a challenge not only in terms of freedom of expression, but more broadly. And Cathy O'Neill wrote a book that I think is particularly pertinent called Weapons of Mass Destruction, because what we see specifically in terms of content moderation and the combat against disinformation is algorithmic bias and disinformation can be just as viral as, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic itself. And we see very concretely in trying to look at how to harness AI for content moderation to combat fake news and disinformation, the challenges that exist. So first challenge is, of course, NLP. What are the limits in terms of NLP? But second challenge, what is the possibility of having perpetual human agency and oversight over such a mass of data and information, which is a real challenge. And then we see, again, reflecting on NLP, and I was just talking with a colleague the other day saying how funny it was that when you type AI into Google Translate and you try and translate it from English to French, it translates AI to influenza aviaire. So we see even at the most basic level, the fact that there is a challenge in terms of content moderation across these different languages. But here, it's really not just a question about freedom of expression. And I'd like to highlight that it is, in fact, a question of life and death. And actually, just this weekend, there was a great article that was published in the MIT Technology Review that highlighted the coming war on hidden algorithms that trap people in cycles of poverty and the ways in which this kind of algorithmic bias perpetuates structural violence that has real life impacts. So very concretely, this article looks at the review of lawyers who are uncovering, navigating and fighting automated systems that deny, for example, in the United States, the poor housing or jobs and basic services, and raises the question, how can you cross-examine an algorithm? What is the future of cross-examination of an algorithm? And it highlights the ways in which this has an impact on people's lives. So to share a story, for example, in Michigan in 2013, an effort to automate the state's unemployment benefit system, the algorithm incorrectly flagged over 34,000 people for fraud. Of these 34,000 people, from an automated algorithm, it led to a loss of benefits and bankruptcies, but also an enormous amount of suicide. So this leads me, building on what Lorna, you were saying, to the question of the notion of the coded gaze, which is something that a brilliant, what she calls herself, poet of code, Joy Boalamwini, coined, and the need for coalitions to fight for algorithmic transparency, but also algorithmic justice. And what we see at UNESCO as the two major challenges in ensuring algorithmic transparency and justice are, let's say, two levels. The first is a question of a lack of literacy. So these solutions are being deployed without a basic understanding of what artificial intelligence is as a technology, but also without a basic understanding of how artificial intelligence as a technology impacts our human rights, like data protection, like privacy, like non-discrimination. So we have a lot of really interesting principles in terms of ethical and human rights-based principles for responsible and trustworthy AI, with these very beautiful macro level principles like explainability, like transparency, like responsibility. Everybody agrees these are important principles. Many people do not understand how to translate these principles into actual practice, whether it's at the level of the technical community or the private sector. And there is this movement from looking at responsible AI, no longer as, for example, something related to CSR, but as part of the core mission of companies like Microsoft. But many people do not understand these risks. So we need to address and build this kind of literacy, both in terms of digital literacy, but also in terms of ethics and human rights. The second challenge that we see very concretely in this regard is the question of bias in data sets. So this embedded bias in data sets comes from the fact that the AI sector as a sector is a sector that is not as diverse and inclusive as it needs to be. So what we see at UNESCO is that technology is not a mirror for society and inequalities in society, is in fact a magnifier and an incredible opportunity to rectify in the technology, but also in our societies, the injustice and social inequalities and growing digital divide that exists. But for this, what we need is principles and an understanding of these principles. So at UNESCO, and many of you will be familiar with this, we are in the process of developing a global standard setting instrument in the form of a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this recommendation, which is shaped by 193 countries, shaped by experts from around the world in multi-stakeholder processes, shaped by the private sector, with the technical community, with the governments, has an approach that looks at guiding values and principles, but also policy areas. And one of those policy areas, very concretely, Jean-Yves, is the question of human agency. And what we see as an emerging kind of global consensus is the need to ensure in the entirety of the AI lifecycle, human oversight and determination. That this is absolutely necessary, reflecting again on what Lorna was saying in the beginning, but also the need to develop tools that when we go wrong, we can remedy. So I know that Microsoft has been, for example, a very big champion of the follow-up of the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation and this approach of connect, protect, respect, and remedy. And we need to focus now on the aspect of remedy. When, for example, content moderation goes wrong, what can we do to remedy it? So we need to work on, for example, developing ethical impact assessments that can be deployed as a solution that can address these challenges in terms of freedom of expression, but also in terms of, for example, the bias that we see in recruitment tools, which has made the front page for several months, among other areas. And I'll stop there for now and look forward to talking more about it going forward and to hear from Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sasha. And it's good that you're stopping here, because as I was listening to you, I'm thinking, Wow, I'm sure Steve has some comments to make, especially on your last points.
Just some very brief comments. How many hours do we have? So I love the setup already for the discussion. I'd like to start with a couple of things, and they're high level, Sasha, but I think they're critical in order to go deeper and talk about the practical realities. One of them is the importance of taking a human rights approach to this. And one of the things that happens out there is, you noted, everybody's printed principles, and some of them sound very nice. And then you scratch your head, even as somebody who's in the industry, and say, well, what's this actually going to mean? What will they do and what will they not do based upon these principles? They really have to come down to commitments that can be trusted and deserve to be trusted. But I always start in these conversations by noting what is the difference between ethics and human rights, because people talk about ethical principles or ethical AI. And then there's the idea of AI that's respectful of human rights. And we touched upon dignity and the rights to freedom of expression or privacy. I like to frame it in terms of, I don't care whether we talk ethics or human rights, so long as we always are using as our kind of North Star the most vulnerable persons, and it's individual persons, the least protected, not what's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but how do we actually make sure these things work to enhance human dignity? The bedrock of international human rights is all persons are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And if we don't start from that, we're going to go off right off the bat. It's kind of like, you know, when you start on the road, if you're going south and you're trying to head north, it's going to be a long journey. The other thing that I think is worth doing is noting the way, what is artificial intelligence and machine learning? And I think it's really important for people to ground themselves in the idea, it is at its heart really just pattern matching. It's highest level statistical mathematics, saying with this, I can draw the conclusion, that is, I have increasing confidence as the machine algorithm, that this is the expected outcome. But think about what really happens, even with facial recognition. A camera doesn't look at a face and say, well, it kind of looks like Steve, or it kind of looks like Sasha. What it has is a bunch of zeros and ones on individual pixels. So a machine, of course, this computer has everything reduced to computer code. Now it's got a bunch of zeros and ones in front of it. How do we actually think that works? What's going on when you do this? What it's doing is actually finding colorations and where there's more or less dark or light or different colors, and then trying to make a prediction using statistics, say this is more likely a human face, or it's more likely a cat or a dog or a beach ball. But the computer has nothing to go on other than zeros and ones that come in. So once people understand that it's really this high level mathematics, then we can start talking about what is really going on, and should we be deferring these incredibly important human decisions to a machine. The machine is only a tool. It can do pattern matching in incredible ways, but it's really only matching patterns. It's not bringing any quote unquote intelligence. It's just bringing mathematics and pattern matching statistical abilities to a challenge. So let me point out then that goes to this issue of bias. And I'll stop here, even though there's a lot more I'd like to say. And the bias is not only because we don't have representative populations in the engineering community. All of the data that goes into a computer has been collected at some point by a human being and then said, hey, this is relevant to the machine I'm building. But it's human beings who create bias in the first place. It's a human problem, not a machine problem. And so now we have to go, okay, let's really ground ourselves in the nature of bias. Why is it that most of our medical records are, in the United States, for example, highly correlated with middle age and better socioeconomically situated males? Well, maybe it's because those are the people who had insurance at a time that hospitals were collecting data. People who needed the services but were in other populations didn't generate the same bulk of data. And now the machine, not because it has an intention of doing biased things, the machine pattern matches against a biased data set. And we have that throughout the machine learning environment. And then my final comment will be, because any of these might be great conversation topics for discussions, but my final one will be, we should not expect a machine to solve a human problem. We should expect a machine to provide additional insights to us, data, and we should be probing that, which is why this idea of transparency is at the core of everything we need to talk about. I do want to leave one link for everybody on the call. And there's a great little video we did on some of the work that's come out of Microsoft Research on how you actually interrogate to get to a transparency and explainability level that works for human beings and not engineers on machine learning. So if you do a search on channel 9 is in the digit that comes before 10, on Microsoft, and look for machine learning interpretability toolkit. But it's an actual API, an application programming interface, where you can go in, and what you effectively can do is have the software look at any given machine learning program and then say, here are the key things that are driving the outputs. If you start seeing that these are either gender or race, or you go further and say, okay, gender and race are not explicitly called out, but are you using things like zip codes, which are highly correlated in the United States with socioeconomic and racial subpopulations? So you can actually start interrogating it. And we as Microsoft since 2018 have had one of our core principles that you absolutely must have transparency around a machine learning solution, or it doesn't deserve trust, and we're not going to get the kind of accountability and trustworthiness that we're all counting on. There are other challenges with actually having a machine understand what is a true fact or not. So we've come up with partnerships with people who are doing things, NewsGuard, for example, where they actually look at the quality of the journalistic enterprise much more than the actual individual piece of content. And it goes to this thing of digital literacy that you touched on. But I should stop so we can have a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Again, I have multiple questions coming up, and I listened to you, but it's a dialogue between the three of you. So Sasha, Lorna, any reaction to what you have heard so far?
Steve, I love the emphasis that you put on the fact that it is not the machine that has embedded bias, it is the people that are feeding data into the machine, and the need to invest in order to have a diverse and inclusive AI, invest in an AI sector that is diverse and inclusive. And I just like to also salute and highlight how much UNESCO appreciates working with Microsoft specifically on this issue as co-leads of the Women in AI Daring Circle, looking specifically at gender bias and embedded gender bias in AI. And just to feed what you were saying in terms of data with a data point, there is a recent research that highlighted that if there's not a better representation of diverse mindsets in the development and deployment of AI, then evidence suggests that by 2022, 85% of AI projects will deliver erroneous outcomes due to bias. 85% will deliver erroneous outcomes. So it means that we indeed need to invest, linking to what you were saying in terms of digital literacy, need to invest in a diverse and inclusive AI sector so that the data sets are rectified by the human beings that are developing these data sets. And just very quickly, another point in terms of this specifically, UNESCO recently undertook research and made a publication called I'd Blush If I Could. And we called this publication I'd Blush If I Could because at the time, if you asked a voice assistant that will remain anonymous, or if you said to the voice assistant, you're a slut, the voice assistant would respond, I'd blush if I could. A woman was not behind training that model to respond, I'd blush if I could. We, building on this research, did a survey in cooperation with a software company that asked this amount of respondents to name a female leader in tech. And 10% of more than 100 people that were surveyed could name a female leader in tech. Half could actually name a real name. And a quarter of the half of the 10% said the most famous woman in tech, her name was Alexa or Siri. So it means the most famous woman working in technology is a gendered voice assistant. And this points to a very serious issue beyond the fact, the statistics point to the fact that 6% of software engineers, for example, globally are women. Only 22% of AI professionals globally are women, and there is an underrepresentation, and here I'm focusing on the question of gender bias, but there's also an underrepresentation in terms of, for example, the visibility and the work of AI researchers coming from the global south, which is contradictory because in fact there's a lot of really incredible innovations, particularly in response to how to use AI-powered solutions to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic that, for example, are coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a need to invest in a better and more inclusive and diverse AI technology, AI economy, and AI sector so that we can indeed rectify this bias. And this at UNESCO is really one of our priorities. If we want a society that is diverse and inclusive, we need to aspire to build an AI system life cycle in terms of the design and the teams that are designing, in terms of the teams that are deploying, and in terms of the teams who are developing this technology that is as diverse and inclusive as our societies ourselves. Otherwise, this kind of embedded bias will continue.
Thank you, Sasha. I just remind you that in February, we'll have another session on women in technology, and all what you have just said will be very appropriate at the time as well. Lorna, turning to you, any reaction to what you have heard from Sasha, from Steve so far?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for so many really rich interventions. There's so many things to pick up on, but I would really like to just pick up on the transparency point that that everyone has mentioned so far, and just to really reiterate and underscore how critical this is. It's a word that we are all talking about all the time because it's always one of the ethical principles that that comes up, and there's a risk that we treat it very narrowly or just as sort of a throwaway word because it comes up as one of these core words and ethical principles. But I think that you know, in this session, and I think more generally in policy debates, we're starting to get much more precise about what we mean and what the demands are in relation to transparency. But I think one of the big problems that we still have is transparency to users and to people affected by decisions when there is some kind of automation being used in a decision about them or a service or a process about them. So just even that fact is still difficult to actually get information on, and we're still so reliant on the fantastic work of investigative journalists, of civil society organizations in revealing these instances. So there's the transparency of use, which still I think is a really big obstacle for human rights. But I think what's also come up in this session is, even when we know it's happening, how do we actually ever get the chance to effectively challenge these decisions? And I think there's a lot more we need to understand about what does it actually take if an algorithm is being used in a decision about someone or around service allocation or resource allocation. What do we really need to know? Because the zeros and ones that Steve's talking about are not really going to help us as individuals or us as a community to challenge. But what is it that we need to know? We know the proprietary interest can be a barrier, so we know that that's something that is important to work around. But what do we actually need to know about how these technologies are used in decisions to actually be able to challenge them? And what do we need to understand about how humans work with algorithms in risk scores or in predictions about future behavior? You know, you brought that up at the beginning, Jean-Yves, about how will humans actually be able to do this? And I think that that's a question that we've been asking for many, many years, you know, as a community, about how do we prevent humans deferring to algorithms, even when they're just used as a supporting piece of evidence, but something that I think is still really understudied and not understood well. So I think that we really need to be able to start breaking down these questions a lot more so that we can understand how does a user challenge, how does a decision maker actually work effectively so they can maintain their independence, not overly defer, but also use, how do they actually get the chance to scrutinize and interrogate what they're being given? And what kind of systems of oversight can work effectively to really understand, you know, is this an area where we shouldn't be using algorithms, Or if we're using them, how do we actually safeguard against? And I think we're still really at the level of talking about principles, but we need to really figure out what the effective processes are to really be able to protect human rights. And I think that's sort of an agenda item where I think we can work a lot more on and understand and be able to get transparency again about where people have been using algorithms in decision-making processes. How do we learn and get transparency about what those processes have been and what the challenges are, and where there's learning to be had. So I think it would be great across the state and public sector to learn a lot more about what these experiences have been.
Thank you, Lorna. As you were mentioning when in your second intervention, we've talked a lot about transparency in connection with accountability, and we see transparency something which is very important. Steve, I think you had referred to a video that talks about transparency, but leaving the video aside, to your knowledge, how does a company, a tech company such as Microsoft, deal with this issue of transparency of algorithm, which we know is a major issue, as Sasha and Lorna and yourself have pointed out. So how do we approach this question of transparency? Do you have any insights to share?
Yeah, I think the best way to get at it is why transparency matters to human beings. And it is inextricably linked to accountability. And Lorna, I think it goes to what you said. Where should we be using it? And where should we be using it with extreme caution? And where should we simply not be using a particular technology? We believe that there are some things we can do. For example, we placed our moratorium on law enforcement use of facial recognition in the United States. But generally speaking, our view is transparency in the sense of helping the public. And so this is individual human beings all the way through democratic processes up to passing legislation or regulations or working with engineers, but increasing the information and understanding of the technology is probably the greatest tool we have as a company, even as the science advances in computer science. And so we do a lot of things with, there's a concept of data sheets for data sets, this notion of letting people know what is in the data set and what do you know about the parameters. For example, if you are concerned about gender, if you're concerned about racial or ethnic makeup of a particular data set, get as much data as you can and make that transparent, publish it together with it. Let people know that a particular algorithm has been tested against this data set and not a different one. One of the things that we have in the new Washington state law that goes into effect the beginning of this coming year, it was passed last spring, is a law on privacy that specifically addresses facial recognition. And in there, the law now says in Washington state that you need to have your algorithm such that it can be tested independently by third parties. It doesn't mean you lose intellectual property, because as you'll see if you look at the link on that I pasted, there are ways you can do things to look at the outcomes of the system rather than looking at the particular proprietary ways that you weighted things inside the system. But we do think that providing information to end users, to external parties, to test, it's the way science has always worked. You publish and then people challenge, and can it be reproduced? And if it is reproduced with errors, why are those? That's the way you make progress. So we actually think, and it's why it goes back to digital literacy and other things. We think we need more communication and more people asking the kinds of hard questions that Sasha was raising.
Yeah, Sasha, giving it back to you, as Steve was doing. So what's your view on this point?
I love having this banter, as we did also last week with Steve, because Steve, you also last week and just now mentioned something that's really also at the heart of what we see is needed for the development, and particularly inclusive development, of an ethical and human rights-based AI, which is open access to scientific information. And this question of, for example, what does it look like to have a development of an AI commons, building on, for example, a global data commons framework, and what is the link between questions of transparency and explainability with open access. And at UNESCO, our work on digital governance more broadly is guided by our Internet Universality Framework, which was adopted by 195 member states in 2015. And what it says is frameworks for digital governance must be, first of all, human rights based. It's called the Rome approach. We love acronyms at the UN. So first one, R, human rights based. Second, O, it needs to be open. So platforms for digital governance need to ensure open access to scientific information is at its heart. A, they need to be accessible. So this is also part and very much linked to what we were talking about in terms of explainability, but also digital literacy. And the last part, which I also heard Lorna evoke, is they need to be multi-stakeholder. And here, this links directly to what you were saying, Lorna, which I found both eloquent and brilliant in terms of the need to develop frameworks and tools to assess the human rights impact. And this is something that we see as absolutely necessary. And there are more than 200 principles around the world, notably being developed by organizations like the OECD, the Council of Europe, the European Commission, UNESCO, and we're all working hand in hand together. But the question is here, how do we measure the impact of, for example, the adoption of an ethical framework for AI in a private sector company like Microsoft? Also, because one of the things that's necessary in this regard is to underline that innovation and responsibility are not opposites. That you can have innovation, you can have economic growth in terms of private sector, and you can also invest in responsible and ethical AI. And this is something that we see as absolutely crucial in terms of being able to measure impact so that we can affect change. And this is part of, for example, data-driven public policies, but also data-driven program and project management in terms of, for example, how we develop projects related to AI literacy and ethics and human rights literacy. Who is most in need? Where can we have the most impact? For example, recently UNESCO did research where we found that countries that have the most amount of gender equality, for example, Belgium, socially, have the least amount of, in this case, again, women pursuing careers in STEM. Whereas countries that have a much lower level of gender equality, for example, in the United Arab Emirates, have a much higher percentage of women pursuing careers in STEM. So 6% of ICT graduates on a yearly basis in Belgium are women. That same statistic in the United Arab Emirates is more than 58%. So this kind of data, and again, reflecting, Steve, on what you were saying about artificial intelligence, our job is to transform this artificial intelligence, not only into human intelligence, but also to actionable knowledge. So how do we translate, and this is the job of data scientists, how do we translate this data into actionable knowledge that can ensure that we have impact, but that also that we can argue for an ethical and human rights-based AI, but that we develop appropriate tools that can ensure multi-stakeholder governance of the implementation of these kinds of AI-based solutions.
Yeah. Lorna, I don't know whether you wanted to come in right away, but I have one comment I'd make on that. It is a challenge for us that we have, hundreds of statements of principles. And part of the problem is people are making principled statements about a very young science and nobody knows what it'll look like in 3 years, let alone in 10 years. But there are some things we already know. And so one thing I'd like to encourage people to do, take a look at the Microsoft facial recognition principles as we enunciated them in December of 2018. And there, the principles actually aren't these highfalutin, one should, or, always make sure. These are actually promises that we said, we will not do certain things with facial recognition. We will not permit this. We will, it's actually in the framing, not of principles in the sense of high level goals and the rest, but actually commitments being made about the development of the technology, and more importantly, the deployment of the technology. There are things that companies can be doing already that really they're going to do because they're doing it to meet an expectation, a demand, a trust demand from the world at large. And that's the way we kind of go at it as Microsoft of what do we know at this point that we can actually commit to in terms of we will do this, we will not do that. And where should we be on the other hand, doing these things like saying, here are the principles at the higher level that should be informing all of us as we try to come to a standard way of doing it. But I absolutely agree. The goal here is going to be human beings trust us to be empowering them rather than threatening their lives and their rights. And that's the approach that we try to take. But Lorna, I interrupted, and I think it's kind of, you haven't spoken in a bit, so.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think that I think one thing that came out from the comments was we are still really in this early stage of understanding how technology works, even just developing it. And I think that is a big question for us around, should we be using these technologies in high risk areas for human rights? And that has been a debate that has been going on for a number of years. Steve mentions facial recognition technology, but it applies in other areas too. So while we're still understanding how these systems work and getting the data and analyzing the impact, is it appropriate in areas, in decisions that are really high risk for human rights, that we are using them? And I think that always has to be in the forefront of our mind, because yes, innovation is important, but testing technologies in areas where people's human rights, and everyone has mentioned people often in marginalized positions already, testing these technologies in those contexts is a really big risk, and one that we always have to really take into account when we're thinking about red lines and when we're tech ready. I think the number of principles and guidance that have come out is important and exciting to see the commitment to human rights and ethical principles, but it is a challenge because there are so many. And I think one of the things we always have to bear in mind is that we don't need the principles to know that we've got to comply with the law and we've got to comply with international human rights standards and norms. And so that is still always really important for us to be thinking about, and to be thinking about what Human Rights Council resolutions have said and what the jurisprudence is telling us. So that is a really important thing. And what I would say is, in relation to a lot of the principles, and we're just about to produce a study on some of the national AI strategies, while we are increasingly seeing great references to human rights principles, I think there's still a big gap in relation to the consistent references to accountability, to oversight, to remedies, to due diligence. You do not see that consistently across all the different sets of principles and norms. And those are really the processes and the procedures that translate existing obligations and ethical principles into action. And so I think that's something that we really need to keep thinking about. And I think the other thing that we haven't really brought up too much in this panel yet is the importance of identifying risks to human rights before technology is ever out there. So at the conception, in the design stage, prevention is really critical here. Stopping something coming out before there's an opportunity for harm to take place, but then continuing to do these impact assessments, monitoring, due diligence throughout the whole life cycle, and looking at that in relation to individual cases, as well as sort of a systems approach where you're auditing how technology is working across, a whole range of decision making. And again, I think, grievance processes and complaints processes are something that needs to be invested in a lot more, and also being a source of where there might be problems with the way in which a technology is working. And I think, when we think about the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, thinking about linking complaints mechanisms and what's coming up within them to due diligence processes, and also due diligence processes showing where there may be human rights complaints, are another sort of important way of actually making sure that human rights principles can be operationalized. Because it is really critical that we're able to yes, recognize the importance of human rights principles, but also really make sure they're operationalized and implemented in practice. And that we don't have this lag where technology is being rolled out there, but people are not able to effectively enjoy their human rights. And I think that that's something that's really important when we're thinking about sort of all this technology going out there and being developed in this sort of very early stage of this technology revolution.
Yeah, these are really great points, Lorna, and all of you are making really great points. Before we have maybe a last exchange of discussion, I would like to open it to Danielle and see whether there is one question that you would like to raise. I see that we still have 10 minutes on this session, and I would like our three panelists also to think about the one message which they would like to leave us with at the end of this session. So before we go to this last stage, Daniel, is there one or two great questions that you'd like to raise with our panelists?
Sure, there's a number of great questions, but since we're limiting it to a few, I'll go from the very top and just ask in that order. So the first one is from Christina Stanka-Mustia, and she says, lately, there was a big debate on the biases inherent in AI, especially those dealing with big language models, such as used by Google. Who can regulate and support an ethical license on this issue? And another question, I'll take this again just in order, is do you believe that AI, e.g. search algorithms, can decide and remove all the links to the news articles published by the existing brand safety content from the publishers, the same way like censorship applicable to users generated content? So it's really a question about removing content, removing links from news articles through AI. And that's from Valvak Mash.
Great. Thank you. Who wants to take those questions first? Or one of the two questions, by the way. Steve, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I had a phone ring and I had to mute myself. The idea that machines are going to be perfect at removing all bad content when the content itself is created by very clever human beings trying to evade the machine. At one level, you're kind of glad that humans are still smarter than machines. On the other hand, it means bad stuff still gets through. So I don't think that we ought to be expecting a machine to be perfect. It's going to have to rely on other tools, and those are in the realm of transparency, digital literacy, and accountability. If you impose regimes that make it more costly for certain content to be on the web, people will respond to that. The challenge is, as in everything in the human rights space, there are tensions. Do we want to limit freedom of expression to make it safer? Probably, yes, because freedom of expression is not an absolute right. But who actually decides that? And do you want to hand that off to a private company, or do you want democratic processes to engage? Once you get in the democratic processes, you get each side claiming the other is biased, trying to skew the public information in there. So these are not things that we're going to find a quick, easy solution to. I think it's going to be a systemic approach of increasing transparency, increasing digital understanding and literacy, and saying, in a very democratic way, what are the types of limitations we want to have? But I think if we're measuring whether we hit 100% effectiveness as whether or not the tool is helping us, that's the wrong measure. The question is, would we be better with these tools to help remove stuff? Or are we better getting rid of those tools and relying upon human beings to do the superhuman task of looking at billions of things coming in every hour and say, we can staff that accordingly with people sufficiently trained to do the right call 100% of the time. We're in this place where human life is kind of messy. We want to be clear that AI offers a tool. It doesn't offer a perfect solution. And now we have to be thoughtful how we build those tools, how we use those tools, and how we continue to improve those tools. That's my general approach to the question.
Sasha?
Sure. I would love to address the first question in terms of questions of who can regulate and support ethics. And I would like to thank the person who asked that question, because I'm sure it's in direct reference to what is making the front page of, anyway, all of my social media feeds in terms of Timnit Gebru and the recent questions of research and ethics inside private sector companies, which is indeed something that should be making the front page and that we should be talking about. One of the things that we see at UNESCO is the need to develop models for multi-stakeholder governance in terms of implementing both soft law and hard law regulations around questions of artificial intelligence. And reflecting again on what Lorna said, all of this must be based on human rights and international human rights laws. And for example, in countries or in regions like Europe, where we have the GDPR, questions of respect in terms of regulation with regards to data protection and privacy, linked, of course, to human rights. But one of the things that we see as an added advantage, let's say, in the ways in which public policy is changing, is that public policy is no longer a top-down process where old white men behind closed doors are developing policies that in reality will never be translated into practice because they're not based on user experience. And so what we see in terms of AI ethics and the development of AI is this is public policy driven by practice, but also driven by conversations with, for example, the technical community and the private sector, because if they are not around the table from the beginning, developing these principles, they will not implement and they will not adopt them. So the way in which we develop public policy is changing, which is exciting because we have this feedback loop where we now go from the bottom up. So principles can be driven by practice, but we also have platforms for multi-stakeholder governance and multi-stakeholder platforms for responsibility and issues with regards to responsibility. And this is, for example, represented in the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which Microsoft was an essential part of getting off the ground in cooperation with many governments in Europe. And it is represented, for example, in the role that Microsoft is playing vis-a-vis the UN and their representation in their office that represents the company to the UN. So the ways in which we interact across different stakeholder groups in the field of AI is radically changing. What is missing is the possibility to enforce, when situations like Timnit Gebru and what is going on happens, decisions with regards to transparency and explainability. And right now, currently, there is no legally binding regulatory framework on this issue beyond the human rights framework. And this is indeed a challenge. And we see it, for example, in questions of AI and the rule of law and the challenges that judicial operators have in regulating on issues related to this, where there is no global standard other than the human rights framework, which obviously must exist online. And this is a challenge and something that we are working on at UNESCO to address. And we see this as, again, a kind of three-pronged approach. The first is we need to identify and remedy bias. We need to curate and access inclusively. We need to protect research responsibly, and we need to design, develop, and deploy in diversity. Going back, and again, Steve, I really loved what you said in the opening statement that you made in terms of the bottom line is the most vulnerable person. So all of this needs to be in mind. Is this going to reduce human suffering or increase it? And the research that was being done was research to reduce human suffering and should be supported.
Thank you. Lorna, you start. I think you may end.
Thank you. So just 2 points. I think, the multi-stakeholder approach is clearly really critical, and it's one that we need to strengthen. But what I would say is that in all of these spaces, we really need to be able to work on how do we open up these spaces for particularly groups who are affected and have been adversely affected. We don't have a lot of diversity in the conversations about AI regulation and governance. And we need to be able to get a much more pluralistic approach, particularly, as I say, for people who have been affected by decisions that have been made by or with the support of algorithms. Other groups who have a lot of experience working in particular sectors on particular human rights issues, but may not have been working on technology. We need all of these people in the spaces because, as we're talking about throughout this panel, humans are at the heart of all of this, and it's not these technology is being introduced into decision making and processes that we already understand, and we need to bring more people into this conversation and break down the barriers of people thinking this is a conversation about technology, because it's not a conversation about technology. It's a conversation about every aspect of our life, and we need more people there to be able to challenge and introduce friction and have new ideas about these technologies and how they might be used in life. So I think that that's one really important thing that we need to think about. And then just the question again about remedies, we've just mentioned courts there and we haven't talked about them. I definitely think that courts can't be the sole solution. And I think there's now going to be a lot of pressure on the judiciary in the absence of dedicated regulation to be trying to come up with answers about what is necessary, what's proportionate, what is legal. So we don't want to just only be finding out the answer to these questions through courts, but we do need to make courts much more accessible and more able to deal with these questions. And we're only starting to see some cases come out now. And I think that figuring out how to make the judiciary a key player in this, but also enable people to be able to go to court is really critical, alongside other types of grievance mechanisms that are easily accessible to people and don't feel like huge barriers in terms of cost and also the court process. So I think we've got a lot more work to do, both at the regulation end to bring in those most affected and in the accountability end through courts and other grievance processes to enable people to use it. And I think together that will, go a long way around greater human rights protections.
Thank you very much. You have
very, very briefly. I think that was a fantastic summation of the key problem we have here, which is genuine multi-stakeholderism. And actually, courts can be a valuable vector for that conversation of pointing out, here's the wrong and here's the harm. But what we really need to address this very human problem is 21st century multi-stakeholderism, which is bringing all of the voices in, making sure people are heard, but also that people are engaged with what is being heard, and then developing solutions. It's a human problem, and we're going to have our best chance at doing the right thing if we approach it as human beings doing what we do best, which is genuinely empathizing with one another and building for a better future rather than leaving ourselves to whatever the machines throw at us.
I love this final message. Thank you very much, Steve. It's appropriate not only for this panel, but also for this time of the year, generally, but certainly for this panel. That was excellent. I found the discussion really fascinating. We could continue for hours. I thank you so much, the three of you, and Daniel, managing those members in the audience who put in questions and not getting those questions put to you. But thank you so much for your contribution. It's been a great conversation. That's exactly what we were expecting. Those of us who are putting out this digital fast track series, that's exactly what it should be about. So thank you. I hope to see the three of you soon, certainly, but also see the entire audience on our next session of the DFS in February to talk about the topic that you, Sasha, and you, Lorna, also touched upon, which is the role of women in technology and those questions of bias that Steve also mentioned and dealt with. So let's meet again in February, talk about women in technology in connection with SDG 8. In the meantime, I wish you all, and I wish all our audience, really great end of your holidays, vacation, great Christmas. I wish you the very best for next year, and I look forward to seeing all of you in February. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for the great moderation, Jean-Yves.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye all. Goodbye.
Bye.